Joanna is a professor in psychology at the University of Warsaw. I'm sure many of you are familiar with her work on sort of dynamic systems and symbols and ecological psychology. She's bringing together a lot of interesting things in very interesting ways. So I think it'll be a good chat. I'm going to hand over to Varun. You have to unmute yourself.
Okay, so welcome, Joanna.
Hi.
Welcome to the Rotman Institute of Philosophy. We're glad to have you here today. So, before we get into the paper, do you just want to quickly say a little bit about your background training and why you chose this paper to discuss today?
All right. So, my background, I guess, very briefly, I come from Poland, as you know, from Warsaw University, and there I was in the late 80s and the 90s. I was very interested in neural networks, and my master thesis was on a flexible model of categorization in neural networks. So you can see that it was end of the 80s, so it was kind of quite novel, at least in Poland. And then I came to, for a PhD, I happened to end up in Florida Atlantic University, where there was a Center for Complex Systems and Brain Sciences, led by Scott Kelso. And then I ended up in a very strange situation, because I was in a very traditionally psycholinguistics lab led by Lou Shapiro, who was sort of a student of Chomsky. And then my other supervisor was Betty Teller and Scott Kelso from Dynamical Systems. So then I was this poor graduate student that was sort of put in the clash of very formal models of language and whatever transformative generative grammars. And then on the other hand, about people, between people who are saying, well, there are no representations that you can manipulate, and how do you want to talk about language like that? Language is all dynamics and so on. So then, I had to cope with that. And, you know, I wasn't in this very comfortable situation that I could say, just go with the sort of dynamical flow that I would, my soul would want to do that, basically. But I had this other supervisor who showed me what a beautiful structure language is. And, you know, this structure had to emerge from all those dynamics. So here is my background. I think you can feel the struggle that I was living back then.
Indeed. And any reason you chose this paper for today's talk in particular, or?
I think Ed asked me to discuss this paper.
I did suggest it.
But I think it was a very good suggestion, because I think this paper summarizes very well what I've been working on. Maybe it doesn't show you the whole work that I have done on the level of sort of physical systems that have their own dynamics and that have to have some symbolic modes in, especially when they are biological systems. But it gives you a glimpse of the work that came later, for which this background was developed, basically to understand better language and what's going on when in language emergence and development. So yeah, it's pretty much, and then it continues, but the novel things I think are not so well worked out that they form coherent papers. So I think I felt comfortable discussing this one.
Okay, great. Thank you. So in this paper, I mean, very interesting, by the way. So there are three, let's say, three different approaches or three different pillars, which you call pillars. One is ecological psychology, one is cognitive semiotics, and one is dynamical systems theory. So, and the paper seems to be taking using these three in a unique way. So could you just maybe briefly describe these three different approaches?
Right, because it seems to me that none of them was sufficient for me to discuss language emergence from dynamics, and that's why I felt compelled to sort of try to merge them, although I feel that pieces of those approaches that I merged are not so diverse from each other, that those three approaches, even though they might seem very, very far apart from each other, especially cognitive semiotics and semiotics in general, from, for example, dynamical systems or ecological psychology, I just think that they are not as far away as a purely symbolic approach, for example. So ecological psychology, as you know, is a type of psychology that is the real embodied psychology. Come on, right? So this is a psychology that discovered embodiment right from the very beginning and started from embodiment. And that treats as primary the relationship between the organism and the environment, and that focuses on determining what is informative in the environment and how it becomes informative for an organism. It's a very, very different psychology from the stimulus and response psychology, which is both behavioral psychology, behaviorist psychology, some of it, because not all, also, and the symbolic approach, which is also input-output psychology. So this is what is important in ecological psychology, this importance of the environment and the relation to the organism. Then the second pillar, let's say, is dynamical systems, but it's very, very natural to merge dynamical systems with ecological psychology, because ecological psychologists mainly work within dynamical systems. You have great models of things like navigating space, for example, by Warren or other people, or movement coordination by Kelso. It's all basically dynamical systems models. So here I don't have to explain, but then the cognitive semiotics is the part that is perhaps new to this approach, and probably doesn't have much background. There's not much background to merge the strictly semiotic approaches with dynamical systems, but I find that it's a very useful approach. I don't feel an expert on pairs. I think it's a very, very difficult reading. So I collaborate with Terence Deacon, who I think I sort of trust his reading of pairs. And I was surprised also while reading myself some pieces, both by Terry and by Peirce, how actually dynamics fits there. And I think that we didn't take advantage of the semiotic framework in recognizing in those dynamical processes and constraining processes that we are recognizing in dynamical systems, when we have to talk about things like language and symbols, we are not recognizing how different they are, the relationships between the symbolic or sign processes, let's say, and dynamical processes. And cognitive semiotics helps us making those relationships between signs, let's say, and dynamics more nuanced. So it's not just constraining, or it's not just association. I don't like the term association, but it's not just one type of constraining. It might be constraining due to different historical processes, different trajectories, and different relationship between the form, the symbolic form, or the sign vehicle, and the process, the dynamical process. So semiotics brings a lot of tools, conceptual tools that help distinguish those processes.
Okay. Great, great. Just on those lines then, so one of the punchlines of your paper is, you should treat language as a system of constraints and not as a cognitive skill or a cognitive module. So, so the ecological approach is kind of different to the standard or traditional computational approach. Maybe could you just say a very few words to those about them, about these different approaches? What's different about the ecological approach to language as compared to the computational approach?
I think I've lost part of your question.
I can
repeat it? Can you repeat it, or shall I?
Sure.
You will see if I understood it.
Oh, no.
Okay, so repeat it.
Okay, no. So my question was, so on, because you were mentioning about constraints. So in this paper, so language is being, so one of the theses proposed is you should treat language as a system of constraints and not as a cognitive module or a computational skill. So could you just maybe briefly say how the ecological approach to language is, contrasts against the standard computational approach to language? Maybe just a few words.
I think in the ecological approach to language, it is still, I'm not sure if it's still very much accepted that that you have this kind of relationship between symbols and dynamics that we are proposing. But if it is, assuming that it is, the main difference is that where we see symbols not as having their own rules and the system is not being self-explanatory within its formal shape, but basically symbols are carried by dynamics, stem from dynamics, and control this dynamics. So all the approach is based on this relationship, on the controlling and the constraining relationship between what are the forms, the symbolic forms, some kind of forms. They don't have to be symbolic, they can be other repeatable forms, but they have to have a shape, and the dynamical processes that they control. And then I was suggesting, I don't know if you saw my email, that I will actually bring my presentation now, or
yeah. Oh yes. So please. So before we get into the next, can you just quickly just share your screen and
Yes. So I will try to do this right now, and I will share the computer sound as well, because I have some baby videos that I would like to show you. Okay, so you will also see some of my background here. I forgot that some of my videos can come in this little tab when I see your faces, but I hope not too many. All right. So I apologize also because Ed told me to just have 3 slides, and I have 10, but 4 or 5 of them are videos. So I hope it's okay. So as I told you, I was really fascinated by this dynamical systems approach to cognition, which was which was present in the Center for Complex Systems and Brain Sciences. You might know Scott Kelsow's book, 1995, right? Dynamical Structures, I think it's called, and Bob Port. And Tim Van Gelder book, also from that time, which pointed to acknowledging dynamics in cognitive processes. And I was really ready to embrace only the dynamics, and I was very much hopeful that just the dynamics will also give me language. But then Scott Kelsow, at that time, I was coming to him with those questions about language and saying, but look, Scott, I mean, all those processes are dynamics. We are sitting here, we are talking. Those are all physical, let's say, stimuli or physical things we are throwing at each other, and we are moving, and then we behave as a consequence of the things that we are saying, and so on. Those are all dynamical processes, also processes in our brains, etc., etc. But how can they ever account for also such stable structures that we have in language? And Kelso then gave me the papers of Howard Patti, in which, as you may very well know, Howard had a different or had very good reasons to say that dynamics is not enough. So Kelso was kind of quite I don't know, pushing even outside his scope or outside his opinions to sort of steer me in this direction and saying, look, maybe it's not enough to just talk about dynamics. And then, I mean, I wanted to say just 2 words about Howard Patti. He's a physicist himself, but he got interested in cognition. And it was at the time, I don't know, you probably know, and if you don't know, please go and do read those papers. There was a great debate between Fodor, Pilishin on one hand side, on the side of computational cognition, and then on the side of ecological psychology, it was Turvey, Carello, Michaels, Shaw, Mace, and other people. Yeah. There was this great debate in 81, I think, in CogSci or Cognition, one of those 2 journals. And Howard was kind of reading this debate and saying, guys, come on, don't quarrel. You need both, okay? You have your right, and the other group has their right to say what they are saying. You can describe cognition as symbolic, and you can describe cognition as dynamic. But the question is how the 2 come together, right? So Howard himself bases his work on this. I don't know if you can see. Can you see the quotes? Because I might have.
Oh yes.
Okay, good. That if you want to describe any kinds of functional organization, you cannot base your description only on laws of physics, because they sort of are very democratic, the laws of physics. They work on everything in the same way. And if you want to have a functional structure, you need to constrain the degrees of freedom of systems behaving according to laws of physics, but you put additional constraints on those naturally behaving systems. And those very constraints are very hard to describe very hard to describe exactly in the same terms of physical laws. So you actually need something else. You need another kind of description. And here he's talking about machines, but the same pertains to living structures. In fact, I recommend highly this paper, Life's Irreducible Structure from Science by Michael Polanyi in '68, where he says machine as a whole works under the control of 2 distinct principles. Higher design harnesses the lower, the laws. So he already points to the sort of duality, at least duality of description. And then he goes on, if the structure of living things has a set of boundary conditions, this structure is extraneous to the laws of physics and chemistry which the organism is harnessing. Thus, the morphology of living things transcends the laws of physics and chemistry. This morphology of living things is, for me, it's really this call for form. And you can see the same in, sorry, but I lost the ability of, okay. You can see the same kind of functional role of form in Merleau-Ponty work, for example, when he talks about the body, the form, again, the morphology, as something that is intentional, that brings the function into the processes that are dynamical, that can be described by ordinary laws of physics. And this is, I shouldn't maybe say it here, as I told Ed and Varun, I am in a bit weird state of mind these days. So I will not act like I know a lot here, but I do feel myself like walking on Mobius strip often, especially when we come to this form, the question of form, because when we think about form of the body, we think about embodiment. We think about those things that are very hard to put in computational terms, the body, the morphology. On the other hand, this is exactly what gives the form of in the dynamics versus symbol versus formal, let's say. So you can you see that there is something wrong here, and maybe you can help me. Maybe it's all very simple, but I just don't see it. It's very possible. So anyway, Howard was fascinated also with Polanyi, Howard Patti, and I very much embraced his let's say ontology. I'm not a philosopher, so I will say probably some very inaccurate words to you, and you can correct me. But he exactly saw this necessity of the description of any living things, any functional things. But in Howard, he was interested in the theory of information in biological systems. So in any biological system, he would see the need for this duality of description. In other words, dynamics was not enough. Maybe it was dynamics on two different time scales. I never got clear on that, if that could be reduced to such a notion. But it seems, for the reasons we hopefully will see later, that it's not so simple. He talks about forms that are in a controlling relationship to dynamics, that have a power of binding certain degrees of freedom to make the given dynamics functional. And those constraints have to have a different description. So we have hierarchical constraints which harness matter to perform coherent functions. And seen from this viewpoint, if you see symbols as such constraints, and he said he actually thinks that symbolic systems have this role of functional constraints in the case of living beings. Then if you have those symbolic forms, you will never find it's probably equivalent to the Chinese room story, that you will never find meaning just going on this level of the description of constraints only. You have to see what kinds of work those constraints are doing within a dynamical system. So it's useless to search for meaning in symbols without complementary knowledge of the dynamics being constrained by the symbols. So then, okay, I wanted to research language, right? So okay, I take it from Patti and others, Polanyi too, that okay, I can see linguistic vehicles, let's say utterances, as constraints on our interpersonal situations, on my working brain, on our interaction, etc., etc. So where should I focus? What should I mean, I was sort of overwhelmed by the plethora of those dynamical events that are in contact with language as a symbolic system, if thought about as a set of constraints. And so which dynamics, in which system? And then I was really, you can see, I won't read through that, but you can see that you can really think about many time scales of dynamics in many systems. And at that time, I was lucky enough to meet those girls, the two, I don't know if you can see my mouse, yeah? So this is Katarina Rolfing and Iris Nomiku. And we met at some conference, and at this conference, they showed this beautiful they have this beautiful corpus of mothers changing diapers. I mean, nothing really beautiful you would say about that, but this was mothers changing diapers, filmed from the very same positions, in 6 time points, and there were 17 dyads like that. So there's a lot of great data that we could look at. And I saw this particular video and I said, yes, I want to study this because this video looks like that. And I wanted for you to see what I thought was really, really interesting. This mother is calling the baby, and with a particular prosody and particular voice, trying the baby to make him look at her face. But at this point, this baby is 6 months old, so the baby doesn't care for faces of mothers. And so the mother is kind of frustrated that the baby doesn't look at her, and she finally manages for the baby to look at her. And we saw it over and over again, so in our data.
Hallo, du. Guck mal hin. Mäuschen, guck mal nach oben. Hier ist die Mami. Bist du? Gibsch. 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 Können dich umschubsen, hä? Können dich umschubsen. Können dich umschubsen.
Okay, so I was just really, really happy seeing that, because I saw this extremely rich environment, which we later in the paper called social physics, around the baby, and the baby being really pushed into very, very specific behaviors. This mother doesn't let this baby just be. The baby has to look at her face when she calls her name, and she gets to it. And you can see this kind of harnessing into right dynamics a lot. And I thought, okay, this is maybe a very good idea to see, okay, how do symbols appear in such environment? And she's using language a lot. You could hear that she's talking to the baby a lot, but you, just as the baby, because you are not German, and baby, because the baby was 6 months old, doesn't understand everything that she's saying, right? But at some point, the language system emerges. So we started from utterances that are just like any other behavior. There are parts of multimodal coactions. The perception of them is tuned into social enaction, and they are constraints in interaction, controlling and shaping the whole interaction, not just baby's brain, not just baby's behavior like inputs and outputs, but steering the interaction. So we start from this grounded language, and then, of course, we have reversed the problem. We don't acknowledge, we don't assume that we have free-floating symbols anywhere that the baby has to map on whatever, on whatever she or he experiences or sees. But we have rather only the dynamical processes, and then we have to see how language emerges for that. So we started to see how language accompanies certain things, like here.
Oh, großer Junge.
How language can be very much iconic to some gestures and whatever happens. How language can be indexical, because, okay, when I call your name, you are supposed to look at me and smile, right? And in those situations, we saw the language in semiotic terms, right? We saw the language as constraining the behavior of the baby, but we could also, so we could see it in dynamical terms as constraints, as reducing degrees of freedom of a baby, if you will. But on the other hand, we could see those indices and icons being at work, and we could see that they are different, that language has different functions at this time. So then, okay, we thought, so how do we arrive at all at some degrounding, as Angelo Cangelosi suggested that I use this term, but, or ungrounding. So when does this decouple? How come we can talk about situations, and here I'm making a huge jump, but I assume that you read the paper, which allows us to arrive at something more abstract, perhaps, than just referring and just constraining the situations of interaction here and now. Because this is what language does. And here I skip it because I think that I'm talking too long already, right? Ed, tell me. Okay. So I'm skipping very quickly. And here we used Terry's framework, basically Peirce's framework, who says, okay, once you have icons and indices, you don't have a symbolic language. In order to get a symbolic language, you have to allow for something more to be a constraint, so for something more complex. And according to this framework, you have to see each utterance as grounded both in what you want to do with this utterance here and now, but also it is always immersed, in the case of language, in the case of language that Mother is saying, it's immersed in the system of utterances themselves. And now when one utterance is at the same time an index or an icon to the situation that it is constraining, and then comes another utterances that is also maybe an icon or an index that is constraining the dynamical things that are going there, and they come together, they start to constrain the situation in a different way, in a very complex way, the relational way between those symbols, that they sort of, each symbol being in a relation within a symbolic system, selects only some aspects of this controlling relation to on the level of the interaction. So then we have to arrive at the system in which the relations between symbols are allowed to act as constraints in a dynamical systems. And this is this very magical moment where at the very same time when the relation between indices starts to work, those indices can be said to be symbols. And that's why I didn't really want to give you a definition of a symbol. Let me stop here. I had another video that I can play to you maybe when some question arises, as how we are able to start seeing in development that utterances come in a relation. Okay, so I stop. I think I stop here.
Okay. Thanks, Joanna, for the presentation. So I guess since we're not uploading those videos to the YouTube channels, just to briefly summarize what you were showing us there. So initially, you showed us one video where a mother was sort of playing with an infant and approaching with a finger. And, you were pointing out the social physics of the situation. And then later on, the idea is that that you move beyond merely the physics of the situation and the sort of symbolic nature of what the mother is saying. The mother is saying things the whole time. Comes to take on a meaning, the meaning of the meaning of the utterances that the mother is making is discovered by the infant over time.
Right. There is a huge jump between the physics of the situation and, for example, a fully grammatical sentence that the mother is saying, and we are not reaching there yet with this paper. We are just on the beginning. One of the Valen's questions probably will be about that.
So I think we'll move to the Q&A shortly. So the way we'll do it is, if you have a question, you can raise your hand, and I can promote you to the panel. And you can also type in the chat. It'd be better if I can promote you to the panel and you can ask your question directly. So while we're waiting, I guess, hand back to Varun. We have one more question, Varun.
So Johanna, so I think so most of my questions were kind of embedded to the presentation, but I think you've answered them. One of my questions was, how does this approach, this ecological approach, maybe with further studies, give rise to, compositionality of language? But as you pointed out, it's just the initial stages. Lots more work needs to be done before we get there. Maybe I can just conclude with just one question. So are these interactions, interactions between the mothers and infants, so they seem to be occurring within a particular frame, like an interactive frame, a dyadic involving two actors, so dyadic interactive frame. Is that a necessary condition for the emergence of language? Because babies are embedded in environments where there's no direct engagement with them from different actors. So they see other people interacting, so they're immersed in the social physics where they hear these different, maybe acoustic signals floating around. Do these things do not play a role in the acquisition of language? Do you need to have exactly a joint attentional interactive frame for the babies to acquire language? In any thoughts?
Well, the answer is that it's kind of free for all, and of course, once you have rudiments of understanding, you use everything, even third-person perspective, to, for example, eavesdrop on other people's interaction. But the curious thing about language is that it mostly appears in interactions. I mean, okay, you can have a radio on, I guess, and just hear free-floating language, but a baby at the beginning has, I think, I noticed how curious it is that people do not see how much of the environment of the baby is other people. That we have loads of studies on, for example, object permanence in babies, in 7-month-old, 9-month-old. I mean, do they care about the object permanence? I mean, they care to get fed and hugged, right? So once you realize that that their environment is mainly social physics enacted by others around the baby, then you realize that they have so much opportunity to be in interaction that why should they use anything else at the beginning, right? They are all the time in interactions. It's not like the baby is laying there and, listening to adults talking, and that's how we can learn language. Probably once the rudiments are in, we use everything. But I would say that the first and second perspective is what we should get the most of before moving on, because here is a lot that we didn't see before.
So, Fred Cummins has a question.
Hi, Fred.
Hi, Joanna. Thanks very much. I'm a little bit unsure what the object of study here is, what the word language is supposed to mean. Your background, as you presented it there, was grounded on the one hand in the generativist tradition, with its focus on structures and rule orderings and such like, combinatorics. And on the other, of course, we've got the Calsonian, the dynamical background. Knowing both of these backgrounds, I'm not sure that the insights to be gained from dynamics would necessarily speak to language as conceived of by generative linguists. Some of us in linguistics are concerned with loosening the very notion of language and distinguishing between first order languaging, which is what we witnessed in those videos. That is the flow of interaction, various forms of coordinative and affiliative interaction. And second order language, which may or may not admit of systematic descriptions, but even there, it's by no means clear that such an induction of a second order languaging from first order languaging, that leads to the same notion of the generativists. For a lot of us, the generativists seem to have been disconnected from the real world for 50 years now. And it's not clear that what they call language is anything anyone should worry about, except maybe editors. So can you comment on that? What is the object of study? What does language mean here?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's of course is a key question, and maybe the object of study is to define better and better and understand better and better what is the object of study here. What, I know it sounds paradoxical, but I think maybe let me start from answering how the dynamical approach can feed into the sort of generativist worldview. I hope it is possible at all. So, well, first of all grammars that we have right now, that in some sense are leaky, right? There is always some problems with generative grammars, as we know. Now, when we only want to translate a language into language, just on the symbolic level, some people would say, okay, it's almost done. It works very well. But as long as this language has to be in connection with anything we are doing, any grammatical approach that was proposed has more and more exceptions, more and more, or in Chomsky's, I think if I remember correctly, in Chomsky's case, it got more complex, and then all of a sudden it got very simple, right? When all those very complex grammars went to move alpha or whatever, right? So those leaky grammars should worry linguists, and I think that connection to dynamics will give you a reason why your grammar leaks, for example. That might be one way to appeal to those people who study symbolic layers mainly.
That starts with a preconceived notion of grammar.
That's what?
That starts with a preconceived notion of grammar. I mean, if Chomsky sits in his armchair and opines about the grammaticality of John kicked the bleeding ball, why would anyone care? Why is that an object of study? Why is that paradigmatic for language?
Oh, you mean, I have no idea why they do that, but it's just my question, my answer was, okay, how to get them out of those armchairs and come with us and study the dynamics.
But you want to use dynamics to get to where they are. You want to flesh out the generativist vision, which surely is very uncompelling for anyone in any embodied cognitive science.
Because what's fascinating about language, I'm not sure if I want to get as far as you know, completely understanding a generativist grammarian, but I do think that there is, you know, once the question that Varun asked before also comes in here. Once we get off the ground a little bit, just with the relation between, for example, two indices or icons, right? You call this first order language, I think. But I don't really get this second order the discontinuity between the first order language and the second order language. I think that once we get this relation of one symbol getting into a relation with another symbol right, and we understand what do those symbols lose by entering the relation, we will have a very good start for seeing how this system is then built on. And it is built on by being progressively abstract. And hopefully one day, when I am 200 years old, I will get to the level of one sentence, right? Simple sentence, perhaps. And if you want those systematicities that I discover, if you want to call them grammar or whatever, you can probably do it, because they will be pretty systematic. They will not be super systematic and formal, because language probably is not a formal system in a sense that, for example, mathematics is. But you will get to a pretty abstract and pretty systematic symbolic description without losing the grounding, which is, I think it's pretty cool, because you either now you have kind of two groups of people, ones that study languaging and dynamics and language as coming from dynamics, and the others that prefer to be in this symbolic realm. And I just think it would be so good to know the dynamical reasons why language doesn't behave well on the symbolic level.
Okay, so we have a few people asking questions. Thanks for your question. So let's make it so just ask one question, and we'll go Chris, who I think probably has a follow-up to Fred was asking, and then Robin.
Thanks very much. Hi, Johan. I'm Chris Vijay. I'm faculty at Western, but I'm actually in the Ottawa Valley right now. Yeah, I guess in some sense it's a bit of a follow-up, but it's more along the lines towards the end of the paper, and I appreciate it's very speculative at this point, but you were considering the importance of the relations and how they matter of the symbols to each other, and that's essentially, so this may be an invitation to run your video as well, but we had a reading group meeting earlier and we were discussing that, and I'm just wondering, in addition to the dynamics and so on, it seems to me that one of the important reasons that you can get these extra kinds of relations is precisely because of the ungrounding that you're searching for. I really like the way that you framed it, because I've spent a lot of time worrying about the symbol grounding problem, and I like the ungrounding problem much better. I think it's a much more plausible way to go about it. But given that so if we treat it lexically, that the labels themselves, the words, they can be treated independently, that's where systematicity and grammar and various other things can come from, and that some of that might be constrained just by human cognitive abilities in a way that then may not look like universal grammar the way it was originally conceived, but still might be something about unique human cognition, in that, the great apes, when they learn language, it's a few symbols and it's nowhere near systematic the way that 2.5-year-olds do it, and so on. So I'm just wondering if the words being independent objects is important for them being able to be related, and if there may be other aspects of our cognition that constrain, in addition to some of the dynamics with the social environment that you're talking about, that also constrain the kinds of relations that we might be able to have. Thank you.
You mean, can you clarify for me, you mean the words like utterances?
Yes, so the words themselves become objects in the baby's environment that they can manipulate independently, and it's as they start to become independently of the context in which they're embedded that they start to take this, they start to relate to each other as opposed to being stimulus bound. That seems to be a really important step, and I'm wondering if about the constraints on that may be more than just the dynamics in the environment. Thanks.
Right, right, and yeah, one of the videos I wanted to show is actually how the utterances of the mother and utterances of the baby are very quickly forming a very particular time series in which one can have an input and then the other. So it's a turn taking, of course. And then also I wanted to show how language like babbling of the baby is immediately, let's say, reinforced by the mother in a way and shaped towards the words of language or utterances that would be considered language-like. And I think you are very, very right that the fact that words can be enacted, because they are also enacted. The uttering a word by the baby is an action, right? And it's an action that can be performed out of context without almost any penalty sometimes. Well, it depends what kind of word it is, but this cheapness of reenactment of words, I think, has a lot. I mean, it has a great contribution into this decoupling that you are talking about. And I actually think we didn't underscore it enough in the paper. And thank you for pointing this. Because in general, we think about language as any other action. So in a sense, you have also other examples of languages, sign languages, for example, emerging, right? Well, sign language will be a little bit more difficult because perhaps it engages your body, your face also with facial expressions and your hands. And this repeating is maybe not so easy. The free repetition that you can do just talking out of context. And maybe it's a very good way to study also the difference that those two to bring about. But yes, in our paper we wanted not only to show that language modality becomes independent, sort of, which facilitates noting that two symbols go together, but also that it can be uttered sort of out of context. I don't know if this is exactly what you were asking, but I will stop here.
So I think we're running out of time. So thanks, Chris, for your question. And Robin.
Hey, Anna, thank you. So I really related, first of all, to your academic origins of being kind of in the middle of this, more classical and dominant view. I'm learning classic, like cognitive science in my degree, and then I'm being influenced by people like Mike for the dynamical system sides of things. But at the end of your paper, you hinted at a role for statistical language learning after these foundations are formed in these dynamics. And I'm wondering if you've done any more work on that, or kind of, I guess, found a place where that might be able to fit into this framework.
That's a great question. And I was sort of hoping that after 30 years, Mike and the dynamical systems have become classic. and at least I see it like that. I think there is a pretty big group of people now. We don't feel as alone, I think, as we did at the beginning. But when it comes to the statistical learning, this is maybe in the picture that we show the double grounding of symbols, so that they are grounded both into the interaction and in this layer of other utterances, let's say, or other. Once they become a system, they are symbols. So other symbols. The statistical learning pertains to this, right? To this layer, this symbolic layer. And now I think that we cannot overestimate how important it is to see two elements of this system together frequently. Because then if we have many examples of those two systems, of the two symbols being together frequently in various situations, we can better see how the relation between them can constrain whatever, our thinking, our understanding, etc. So statistical learning here will be hugely important. And I was thinking, preparing the talk for today, that perhaps even we could, according to this framework, maybe sometimes they are even treated as one word, and then we separate them, sort of like learning foreign language. At first, we don't have the boundaries. Well, there are some developmental studies that show this, that children treat sort of statistically frequently appearing words as sort of hollow phrases and things like that. So I would think that these studies are great in themselves, the statistical learning, and they should aid to see the constraining relationship in the interaction.
Thank you. And classical might not have been the best word. Dominant might be more appropriate.
Okay.
Thank you.
There is a methodological pluralism now, so maybe we can at some point all be equally valid. That would be the best, I think.
Yes, it would. Thank you.
Okay, so we're coming to the end of the hour. I think we should end the webinar at this point. So let's all virtually thank Joanna for giving us this talk, and thank Varun for hosting the Q&A earlier.
Thank you so much.
Very interesting discussion.
Thank you, Joanna, for making it today.
Thank you so much, and sorry for being a bit chaotic. I felt that, but well, this is still, I would say, work in progress. And Varun, if I can just briefly answer your questions about grammar, I think they are super important, and we are going in this direction right now, recognizing how the relation between the two words is not just association. Maybe I should have also underscored it in the answer to the last question, that it's not just the association. The association is such a misleading word, because once two words are together, they both change. It's always an emergent phenomenon. One word changes the other, and vice versa, selecting some aspects of its constraining role. And I think this calculus of constraints is something that we should develop now, and I have no idea how to do it, but it's very much needed. I was pointed to various logical and mathematical tools for this calculus of constraints on dynamics, but I haven't found yet a suitable one. This kind of grammar. It is kind of grammar, but it sort of works in dynamics.
So I'm not sure how to end the broadcast without ending this panel.
Okay, so then we should say goodbye, or we should skip to.
Well, so I think Juan was going to ask you a brief question.
Okay.
But also.
Okay. Hi. Yeah. Thank you very much. I really like this work. Yeah. My question was, and I think I'm changing the question now, but it was about the use of the words ungrounding, which I think has been used by Deacon before as well. No?
No, I think we came up with it together at the
Okay.
conference in Lublin, I think in 2016 or something like that, together preparing the presentation.
Okay. Great. Yeah, no, it was something about that. But the question is whether the word is I would probably think that from the inside or from the experience as a language user, it doesn't feel like the right words. I mean, I wouldn't feel that my use of language became ungrounded. I might be able to access a certain kind of practice, which is a very specialized practice in which I understand language in that way. That probably comes after an education process. But I wonder whether there's something to take from that experiential side of linguistic practices, in which language is never really ungrounded. It just becomes wider in its connections to population practices, etc., etc.
It's I don't feel comfortable with ungrounding too. I feel even less comfortable with degrounding. I think I am most comfortable with supplementing with additional constraints.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I like that.
that come from the systemic layer of language as a system. But I like in ungrounding, I like one aspect of this word, and it's the aspect of becoming abstract. And I think that for this reason we decided to leave the ungrounding, because it sort of has to do with, for example, when two symbols meet, when two indices meet to become two symbols, we should say it like this, then selecting aspects from each other means that other aspects are forgotten. So there is a bit of a process of abstraction here, forgetting about some aspects and focusing on the others. And I think this captures this notion of ungrounding. I'm not as grounded as in the same way as a single symbol, because I also have to, as a symbol, respond to this other symbol. I know I'm talking sort of maybe too reifying the symbols into little people, but in a sense, that is the idea that that the system of language is a system that I can put in writing, for example, in a book. And I'm not saying that it ever stops being grounded, but that additional constraints may make it able to read it out of context, in a sense. So this decontextualization is something that makes us retain this notion. And of course, the parallelism between Harnatt's problem. I think it's important for rhetorical reasons right now, but I'm not sure if we won't drop it if we find a better word that would show the retaining of grounding, of course.
Yeah. I like the current phrase that you're using.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's certainly snappier than the other one that you suggested about the constraints, the system of constraints.
Right, but it's the same with social physics. Again, we use it for rhetorical reasons, because to convey that it is as pervasive as physics and almost as reliable as physics, because when I call, my mom comes almost as invariably as when I drop a stone, it falls on earth. And on the other way, it is social, so it's reconstructed for me by the social world. But it completely loses the engagement part of the social physics. I mean, a chair does not jump on me to embrace me when I sit down on it, fortunately, right? And my mother does this. She jumps at me and she embraces me immediately. So physics has this very unemotional and detached flavor to it, which we don't like, and we get criticized a lot, for example, by Hanne de Jager or by Vasu Devi Reddy. How can you call it physics? And maybe it's not the best way. But again, it's for you, ecological psychologists, people, that you like physics, and also for other people that think that discovering physics is important by a little child. And we just show, okay, this physics is maybe important, but the social one, sorry, it's more important. And even later you understand the regular physics in terms of social physics, right? When you ascribe intentions to stones and computers and whatnot.
Yeah, I like the whole reversal of the thinking, the sort of Gestalt switch from the symbol grounding problem, symbol ungrounding problem. And it's a valuable reformulation. I'm glad we've been able to talk about it.
Yeah, but you can see how much in construction is this framework. So if you can jump and help me in any way, I kind of feel like it's a car that is patched out of many vehicles, and it barely goes forwards, sort of shaking and leaking and whatever. And what we are trying to do is fix it and patch it. It is a little bit like that right now. It's the beginning, but I feel it's going, and it's going in the right direction. It helps you frame different questions, pose different questions about development as well. Because, for example, what is now the word spurt? Okay, the word spurt may be due to discovering the grammatical relations, and not the other way around, right? So it's not the grammatical relations appear because we have enough of words. No, it's the minute you understand that symbols are symbols and not indices or icons, you have much more facility in word learning, maybe. So, yeah, it does.
There we go. That's a call to action. Let's fix the clown car of ecological semiotics.
Yeah, ecological semiotics. I like that. Okay, super.
Okay, well, so let's actually end the meeting this time. Thanks again. It's been fun.
Thank you so much. Thank you all.